When someone dies, there is a powerful self-reflection that occurs, because this is something undeniable. It's undeniable that this physical body will become dust, will return to the earth. And yet we can live pretending that's not the case. But when a loved one has died, we can no longer pretend that it is otherwise. And whilst there's inevitable grief, there's also the peace of the recognition that this life is not about what's temporary, and it anchors us to that which matters much more. And that was my experience when my father died before his time of colon cancer at 66. And his funeral / tangi was in New Zealand. And at his tangi a number of things happened, which I'll talk about in another story, which were truly extraordinary. But one was I realized my dharma, which was to continue his work, to teach, to be a spiritual teacher, and to bring forth some of the lessons that he had run out of time to learn during his lifetime, and to take it for another lap around the track, to use a phrase he used. Because my father had passed away more suddenly than we'd expected in the last days of his cancer, suddenly I was able to go to India to complete my first phase of training to become an Art of Living teacher. I had already resigned myself that I'd be cancelling my tickets for the second time, but suddenly his unexpected fast demise had presented an ironic gift of allowing me to go to India, which I did, and I was grateful that I did, because everyone else from around the world who'd come to be with him in his life and death had gone back, and I felt lonely after my father and my whole family were no longer together, and so it was a gift to be able to leave as well, and I was to discover a new family. And I learnt something about what happens when someone passes. There is an energy that remains, and I was very conscious of my father for days after his passing, and he was speaking to me, which wasn't the first time in my life that this had occurred, so it didn't freak me out. The first time had been when my grandfather, who was my other father, my father had not been physically present with me for a lot of his life, so my grandfather had consciously taken over the role of being a surrogate father. And so when he passed, I felt the grief as though I'd lost a father back many, many years ago, 1994. I remember a dream, and in that dream, my grandfather had died. He was still alive at the time, and there was no indication that he was going to die. But in the dream, he had died. And his children were around, and no one was crying. I was the only one crying in the dream. And through my tears, I said to my grandfather, who no longer was, I never had the chance to tell you I love you, which I hadn't. And I heard his voice in the dream saying, it's okay. I know. And that gave me a sense of peace. And then I woke up from the dream, and 5 minutes later, the phone rang, and I knew exactly who it would be, and I knew exactly what it would be about. And sure enough, it was my mother ringing to tell me that my grandfather had passed away during the night. So when my father started speaking to me, it came as no surprise. I'd been prepared by that earlier visitation in a dream. But what he was saying to me was bizarre and made me laugh. My father had been a deeply impractical man, in many respects, known for his poor memory. One of the favourite stories that my brother shared was the time when he had borrowed a sewing machine from a friend, and he took it down to the car, only to get to the car to realise that he'd forgotten the keys for the car. Not an uncommon thing to happen. So he then thought to himself, well, I don't want to take the sewing machine back up all these steps, so I'll leave it here and I'll go and get my car keys. But I want to make sure that by the time I get back to the car, I remember the sewing machine, because he knew he couldn't trust his memory. So I'll put it somewhere where I'm sure to remember it. So he put it behind the back wheel of the car. Went up to get his car keys, came back, got in the car, reverse, and drove directly over the sewing machine, flattening it, therefore saving himself the need for the trip to deliver it back to its owner. So that's a sort of memory my father had. So ironic it was that the things he was telling me was where I left my keys, which I was then looking for. But he didn't just tell me where they were. He said, yes, it's in the plastic bag with Kmart written on it, next to the juggling balls, behind the 2 fluorescent markers. And I'm like, that's a very precise direction. And I'd go, and that was exactly where the key was. And this continued for a few days until I hopped on the plane to India. And then my father's still with me. And he said, talk to the person next to you. His father's just passed away too. A part of me is like, Dad, come on, let up. A part of me is curious, so I strike up a conversation, but I have to be strategic. I can't just say, hey, look, the voice of my dead father has just told me that your father has just passed away too. I'm just trying to verify, is that true or not? That might come across as a little bit odd. So I didn't. So I start asking conversations, trying not to be too pointed, asking him questions about his family. And he said, yeah, my mum and dad are in Australia at the moment. I'm like, see, Dad, you're wrong. But I continue the conversation because I'm in conversation with him. He's a nice chap and we're enjoying our chat. So, feeling content that, well, that's good. I don't have to be too weirded out by the predictive abilities of my passed over father beyond his ability to predict where keys are. I'm in conversation and I'm enjoying it with this guy. And then around about half an hour into the conversation, he says, yes, and when my father died. And I was like, what? Well, I thought you said that your mother and father were living in Australia. He said, oh, yeah, that's my mother and my stepfather. But my actual father, he passed away a few months ago. And I hear Dad laughing at me, going, told you so. And I'm like, okay, you got one over me again. And that was the last time that I heard my father talking to me in that manner. I felt his presence since, but never his actual direct words, giving me such instructions. It was as if he felt his job was to guide over me until I got to the ashram and to make sure that I did get there. And it felt like his parting gift for me was to make sure that I made it onto that plane and got there in a great state, well protected. And I got to the ashram, and then he receded away, as if to say, my job is done. You're in the hands of the Divine Father now. Because that's what it felt like. And everything that occurred allowed me to understand my father better, including the whole episode of the haka, which I tell in another story. One aspect of the haka was that at the time when my father died, I've been going to the gym regularly, so I was looking in pretty good shape. And then I was asked to do the haka, and I led it to a number of people, and day after day, and it must have had a certain amount of masculine energy about it, which some people found compelling, because suddenly I found myself the object of a lot of adulation from women. And that was uncomfortable to me. It was unfamiliar to me, and it allowed me to see inside my father's world. See, my father had been a teacher, and had also been subject to the adulation of many of his female students, and had sometimes succumbed to that adulation. In fact, what ended my mother and father's marriage was an affair. And that woman herself, what ended their relationship was an affair, more than one. And then his third relationship, what ended it was a third affair. And this pattern had gone with him throughout life. And I'd carried judgment of him. How could you do that? I would never do that. How could you place a family at risk and a child at risk? And yet suddenly I was thrust into the situation as if life was saying, see, experience things from your father's point of view, not to exonerate his behaviors, but at least to get a taste of what he experienced on a regular basis. And I experienced it. And it allowed me to not agree with his life choices, but to at least see his perspective. And by seeing his perspective, that was enough to drop any last traces of judgment and be totally free and have nothing but unconditional love for my father. So ashram means without effort, and without effort what happens is healing happens, grace happens, life circumstances arrange themselves to cause you to grow in not a slow way but at a very accelerated pace. And that was exactly the lesson that I needed to move on, because without that there would have been some lingering fear about stepping into being a leader and being a teacher. And what if I continue my father's footsteps? And shunning that for fear that I might. It allowed me to be at peace with my father, but also peace with myself, and to trust myself, and to follow my dharma, which was to lead and was to teach. And without the grace that occurred at the ashram, would not have been possible. So when you're on the path, lessons don't occur in a lesson book. They don't occur in a classroom. But everything in life will organize itself to deliver you the lessons you need, when you need them, in the form you need them, to allow you to move quickly to the next point of your journey, the next chapter.